Hi, I'm Jono Freeman and welcome to Pots, a message of mine in tribute to Sir Francis Bacon. Joshua Guillory even said, certainly if God was ever a man, the man he was Bacon. Engaging with his story, one feels a compulsion to share the journey simply for the joy it brings. If you care to stay passenger, this humble tale of my own has a bearing on the second part of the presentation, which is my proposal for a creative project about Bacon and his followers. First, a note on the title, Pots. This is a play on 1. The name, Mrs. Henry Pott, a critical researcher of Bacon's work and one of the protagonists in my creative project. 2. The pot or pitcher of knowledge, a watermark used by the Bacon family, catalogued by Mrs. Pott. The pot was an emblem for the storing place of the divine waters of knowledge ready to be poured forth. 3. The inference of madness, being a crackpot, in both pursuing the Shakespeare authorship question and in the potential for our obsession with the greatness of Sir Francis Bacon. I see the piece as a series in 3 parts. It captures Bacon's story, his phases of development, as well as the lives of 2 of his devotees or sister knights, so also presenting a history of the authorship question. It also wishes to send a message that if there is indeed madness here, it's of a worthy kind, for it brings with it passion, inquiry and mystery. The second part of the title relates to the nature of this contribution. The inspiration came from Bacon's face on my iPhone lock screen, telling the time and battery charge. I found something interesting and meaningful about new symbols overlaying old images here, making me aware of how Bacon has been received in different times over the last 400 years, the lenses through which we viewed him, and with what technological capabilities. Throughout this time, he's always had a following of those who would look closer in order to recognise his life and achievements. At 100%, this group is still as committed as ever to recognising his legacy. If you'd like to skip to finding out about the project, head to part 2 now. I won't be offended. This first segment provides a sense of personal context for the ideas of the second part. So, part 1, Bacon, Shakespeare and me.
From the dark into the light, Sir Francis Bacon, Knight.
I'm a UK-born Australian theatre teacher, performer, vagabond. I have a Bachelor of Arts from Sydney University, a Diploma in Education from the University of New South Wales and a Masters in Theatre Studies from the University of Amsterdam. I also trained as an actor through the Ensemble Theatre in Sydney at the now dissolved Ensemble Studios. My journey with Bacon begins with Shakespeare. It was not until 3 years ago, 39 years old in Japan, I actually had my first experience of bringing poesie to the stage. Playing Lysander from Dream was like nothing I'd ever known before as an actor. Everything was there for me within the language. During one of the rehearsals, the resident Shakespeare expert employed to assist the actors informed us that the author had both used and even translated other sources for his plays. This information struck me as particularly interesting and it opened a door for me in terms of better knowing the playwright's process. Iago would be my second encounter a year later, and I hope you'll indulge me, but here is a short clip from the production which I was very proud to be a part of.
Work on, my medicine, work. Thus credulous fools are called, and many worthy and chaste dames, even thus, all guiltless, meet reproach. Behold, my lord, I say a fellow! Hello, Cassio.
What's the matter?
Ah, my lord has fallen into an epilepsy. This is his second video on yesterday.
What about the tumble?
Hey, forbear. The lethargy must have his quiet course. If not, he foams him out and by and by breaks out the savage madness. Look, he stirs. Do you withdraw yourself a little while? He will recover straight. When he is gone, I will on great occasion speak with you. How is it, General? Have you not hurt your head?
The foe mock me.
I mock you? No, by heaven. Would you obey your fortune like a man?
A horned man, a monster, and a beast.
As many a beast then in a populous city, many a civil monster. Good sir, be a man. Whilst you were here, overwhelmed with your grief and passion, most unsuiting such a man, Cassio came hither. I shifted him away. You made good use upon your ecstasy. Bade him anon return and here speak with me, the which he promised. Do but encave yourself. Mark the fleers, the gibes, the notable scorns that dwell in every region of his face, for I will make him tell the tale anew. Where, how oft, how long ago, and when he hath and is again to cope your wife. I say, but mark his gesture. Marry, patience, or I shall say you are all in spleen and nothing of a man.
The learning in this production and my approach to character inspired my master's thesis, Playing the Villain, Act of Fascination with Shakespeare's riddle, Iago, the following year. I found that one of the many things that make Iago so fascinating as a theatrical construct is that the author leaves so many questions as to his true nature and motivation unanswered. During my studies, a fellow student also introduced me to another riddle, the authorship question. He suggested that I visit the Doubt About Will website, both being big fans of Derek Jacobi and Mark Rylance. Suddenly, by introducing a doubt, a question, everything started to make more sense. Some compelling bits of information became acutely aware to me. Smash it out! Part 1. Issues. All the information in the plays, the specialist knowledge, the new language, nearly 2,000 new words never heard before, also turns of expression and phrases. The enormous output of the playwright, knowledge, book learning, and life experience, which you can't be born with. Genius at an unprecedented level. The lack of information about the playwright. In his lifetime, no one knows him as a writer, and his family is illiterate. There's also nothing in the way of language, history, or geography of Stratford or Warwickshire within the plays. The work of Diana Price so devastatingly shows that Shakespeare had nothing in the way of a literary paper trail, and the only one of 25 with nothing. Looks like Shax didn't own a book or even write a letter. As a side note, poring over all the varieties I've come across for the Stratford man, Shakespeare was my fave, until I found Shakespeare from the first recorded of Othello. Now, it's just Shax. When people say Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare, they usually also say, look at all the evidence. After watching this video, I asked myself, well, what evidence? Although I saw the film Anonymous in 2011, I carried on believing in Stratford Man afterwards. I'd invested too much in the story, the fulfilled dreams of a small town writer and everyman genius. Almost a decade later, discovering that there was indeed an authorship question, I immediately wrote to the expert I'd worked with in Japan. When I enthusiastically told him about what I'd found, "Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare," is what he barked back. His response was violent and contemptuous, but most of all disappointing. Though it hurt, it only inflamed my desire to know more and galvanized my conviction that there was a mystery to be solved here. It also moved me to fight for this cause in an effort to move past the stigma of a conspiracy theory. Mark Rylance's wonderful piece for theatre, I Am Shakespeare, I think was written in response to the same type of experience, with the same resolve to challenge the wall of anxiety surrounding this debate. It was the series Cracking the Shakespeare Code that introduced me to Bacon, of whom I had no previous knowledge at all. At a glance alone, I discovered he was a renowned philosopher, poet, orator, author, essayist, cryptographer, courtier, lawyer, parliamentarian, statesman, intellectual reformer, and a master of the English tongue. He was the first QC and KC, and in later life became Lord Keeper of the Great Seal and Lord Chancellor, with the titles Baron Verulam of Verulam and Viscount St Alban. How did I not know about this man? In Bacon, then, for me, all of the issues raised by the authorship question were so perfectly and beautifully responded to. Smash it out! Part 2, resolution. Unparalleled education. Genius. Lord Bacon was the greatest genius that England or perhaps any country has ever produced. Alexander Pope. Travel, as well as connections with other true travellers, and the settings for the works corresponding with this. St Albans is mentioned 23 times, by the way. His timeline, including his development and available resources, aligning with the plays. Lawyer Man, his command of the law and the Gray's Inn connection. Comedy of Errors is first performed at the Gray's Revels, with a masque called Knights of the Helmet, written by Bacon. Knowledge, philosophy, science, classics, languages, including Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Anglo-Saxon, Welsh, French, Italian, and Spanish. The English language. Samuel Johnson said that he could have written a dictionary from Bacon's work alone. It's common knowledge that he had a habit of coining new words. Bacon constantly perceived analogies that evoked metaphors and similes, which he expressed effortlessly. The court, the noble houses of England and France, manners and protocol, wheelings and dealings. His muse Athena and the existence of pseudonyms. Francis initiated his knights with helmet and spear, the pen, to shake invisibly at ignorance. His great instauration, a means by which the greatest truths might be discovered and paradise built on earth. So, from this comparatively recent moment I performed in my first Shakespeare play, I've experienced a journey of learning leading me here to Bacon, with this underlying presence of a mystery. I was thrilled to become a member of the Sir Francis Bacon Society, especially in those moments where I get an email from Sir Francis Bacon. As a theatre teacher and student, when approaching any text, we consider the social, cultural, historical and political context from which it's born. We do this to enrich our understanding and appreciation of the work. Teaching at an IB school, as I have, I'm trained to encourage inquiring minds as well as be one. On closer inspection of my own, even I recognise that the creative process in this case does not align with the Stratfordian model. This is something I believe that schools and universities should be engaging in. Then I considered the context of the Renaissance and possible wider contributing forces. I also invested heavily in Peter Dawkins' notion of a studio system with a master and apprentices for the Shakespeare works. So rather than looking for definitive answers on one author, it was more affirming to consider the possibility of collaboration. Meeting Bacon grants a perspective that has, for me, really opened up the notion of the divine play, the very pinnacle of what theatre can be and do. Magic, to better us, manifesting an advancement or a movement upwards. Throwing myself into everything I could find out about Bacon, he started to invade my consciousness and my imagination. A face-swapping Snapchat with an image of Bacon I was mesmerised by illustrates the point perfectly. These little clips came from a strong desire to bring him to life.
My name is Sir Francis Bacon. I am the shaker of the spear and the true author of Hamlet.
With each new piece of information, he becomes ever more vivid and alluring. Watching the Society's lecture by Susan and Bryony on Mrs. Henry Pott, I not only became fascinated by the figure of Bacon and his brother Anthony, but also with those of us through time who have shared in the Bacon experience. A greater picture also began to emerge by putting all of Bacon's works together, as Pott had done. Here I am, of a Saturday night, rewatching the video in Beijing. Agreed. I needed to get out a little more. With this fabulous lecture as inspiration, I began to think about creatively addressing the authorship question in a Baconian direction. I believe that Kenneth Branagh, bit of a hero of mine actually, and his religiously Stratfordian all is true needs to be responded to, especially when the great novelist Henry James believed the Divine William is the biggest and most successful fraud ever practiced on a patient world. Francis is near invisible throughout works produced for the screen devoted to the Elizabethan age over the last 100 years. I found a few exceptions, and it's interesting to note the perceptions of his character and his involvement in the happenings of the time. Nothing much here of his mind or exploits, but he is almost always connected with Essex and with a strange ambiguity about his role. Same in history's page. The 1939 Private Lives of Elizabeth and Essex with Donald Crisp as Bacon. Here Bacon is the mediator, the voice of reason, the schoolmaster. Elizabeth from 2005. Will Keen's Bacon here is shifty, slimy, a co-conspirator with Essex, almost roguish in ambition. Most scenes show him out of favour with the Queen, though finally she has Bacon, a persuasive enough fellow, coldly prosecuting Essex in court. Another series, The Virgin Queen, released the same year. Neil Stuke plays Bacon. He's a little more earnest and earthy, less greasy, but even more missable. Again, Francis is a stranger to Elizabeth and becomes a traitor to the Essex boys' camp. He makes a quick cameo in Will from 2017, but only as a homosexual of renown. Bacon's role as notorious sodomite is to host a hedonistic party for the show. I think Bacon was too curious a human not to be bisexual, but hopefully not so lecherous. I decided to brand myself, pledging allegiance to Bacon and to spreading the word. Getting to know him, one begins to feel like a knight on a quest or pilgrimage. This took a literal form for me in visiting the spaces he had once occupied. I called it the Purple Hat Pilgrimage. Francis always wearing a hat, and controversially royal purple on occasion. In London, I met with Society President Susan, visiting Gray's Inn and Middle Temple Hall. Here I am, happy just to be near an effigy of Sir Francis. On to St Albans, I stayed at the White Hart Inn, where he met with his fellow brethren of the Rosy Cross. I stopped in downstairs at Pots of Art, a wonderfully coincidental title, and checked out the Venus and Adonis tapestry, rich with Baconian imagery. I then paid my respects at the church, where he is said to be buried, though another beautiful effigy remains to be near to. I then walked through the Gorhambury estate, where Francis was raised and spent his final days. On the road to Bacon. He was here. I feel him. The walk was mystical, spiritual, and emotional, which took me by surprise. With the help of internet and maps, I then went off-road in search of Sir Bacon's mount and found the hill he used to stargaze on. The next big step for my journey came in July of last year when I enrolled in a summer intensive through the Prague Shakespeare Company. The course culminated in my playing Paroles from All's Well, which in addition to the masterclasses, armed as I was with Bacon, offered many wonderful discoveries. What's the best way to express what the course was for me? An exercise in empathy, essentially what Shakespeare and theatre is all about. Also an exercise in ensemble, coming together, working and raising each other up. And these are true ensemble plays. The most powerful learning of the course came from Lisa Volpe, who taught us how to be tuning forks of empathy, and that through the alchemy of Shakespeare we can be taught to change and to love. Director Guy Roberts talked about having to step forward to play these roles. They're smarter than us in their knowledge and their use of language. Performing Shakespeare fires the brain, finding out new neural pathways. Being involved with the works, we may connect with people through centuries in a brotherhood, a sisterhood, a club. Frequently discussed on the course was antithesis, how Shakespeare thinks antithetically, lending the plays great depth and texture. I was immediately reminded of Potts's investigation into antitheta within the works of Bacon, finding 1,300 similar entries from Shakespeare. Ambiguity and contradiction, a device always driving the play, was also highlighted as the one thing that makes Will special. I thought of something on the Coalition site, that the one great theme running through all the Shakespeare plays is the difference between appearance and reality, and the difficulty in determining which is which. Naturally, I then thought of Bacon's philosophy, to weigh and consider, and the search for truth that begins with a doubt. Regarding All's Well, after a little research online, I found that the inclusion of the Countess character could account for the presence of Mary Sidney in the circle, who some have called the real sweet swan of Avon. Our knights were women also. This is quite an important point. With the strength of the female voices in the plays, often the heroes, our author is radically pro-women, suggesting involvement. Let's not forget what Guy called the great Elizabethan irony, that a woman was ruler and therefore closest to God. Bertram in his situation may also have echoes of Oxford, who was related to Mary. The research of Alexander Waugh and of course Derek Jacobi, legend, makes a compelling case for Oxford's involvement in the circle. And I was inspired by the thought of a project which might bring together authorship candidates with close and creative readings of the text, of history, and of the key players. During this experience with Paroles, certain similarities have begun to arise with my study of Iago, which surfaced again as I began directing a production of Shakespeare's Othello in Edinburgh. What presented itself was how the author was finding sources, radically adapting them, drawing on a knowledge of literary and theatrical traditions to create something meaningful, flexible, and open for future consumption. Though my production of Othello was set in a militaristic near future, there was a moment when a young Bacon in Elizabethan garb processed through the audience throwing rose petals and crying, "Love!" He was there to make a cameo appearance as the herald on request of the director. More recently, I found the original Norwegian production of Cracking the Shakespeare Code, entitled The Sweet Swan of Avon, with some cracks beginning to appear in the code, having watched it. Compared to this instalment, the UK version has been very careful not to go full Bacon. The tone here is more honest and makes a greater impact. Aside from this, the figure of Peter Amundsen, the organist and amateur cryptologist, really shines through. There's so much more on Bacon here, and the RC are also given proper treatment. With the time afforded Peter's findings, they are clearer and even more resounding. Something appealing about his approach too is that he sets out to falsify the results using a scientific method. Something to end with? Where does it end? Even the society themselves have not reached their final conclusion about Bacon and his reach. Tune in to part 2 for more mystery.